Okay, everybody, here we are again, talking about GDP, and we've gotten the big crucial thing that we've covered is how when I make something and sell it to you, we can look at it three ways. We can look at it as the thing I made, we can look at it as the money that you gave to me for the thing I made, or we can look at it as the money I got from the thing that you made. That thing that I made. Right, so income, expenditure, and production are all going to be giving us the same numbers in theory. And in practice as well, aside from accounting troubles with the tax system. Okay, that's not going to happen. There we go. So we talked about the expenditure approach, and we're going to divide spending arbitrarily into categories. Now, this is not important in the sense that if you just added up all the spending, that would be it. That would be the expenditure, that would be GDP. But it's going to be convenient for us to be thinking about it in terms of categories, because each of these categories is going to, generally speaking, be buying stuff for different reasons. So that when we start trying to understand the world, we can look at these reasons separately. Okay? So there's consumption, that's private households, investment, mostly firms, but also purchases of housing. And of course, there's this huge gray area of things that they're not gray in terms of where we put them in the category, but gray in terms of where we should put them in the categories, because some things are more sort of long-term purchases, and you're thinking of them as an investment. That is, you're purchasing them so you get a stream of happiness over time. And others are more just for now, right? Clearly, buying a chocolate bar, that's for now, so it's clearly consumption. Buying a house, we're really thinking long-term, but other things are more in between. Buying a washing machine, you're kind of thinking long-term as well, right? But we're going to put washing machine into consumption. The important thing here is just to notice that this is completely and utterly arbitrary. The important thing is that we do it consistently and realize that we're doing some arbitrary putting things into different categories. That's because the world isn't neat for categories, but we're going to put it into neat for categories. Then we got government spending. Importantly, this does not include transfer payments. This does not include money that the government just gives someone. It just involves money that the government is paying to buy something, either a good or a service. And if we can, lastly, we have exports. That's the stuff that the foreigners buy, and we subtract off imports because we counted imports. If we can, this isn't going to work. No, we're not going to have pointy. Pointy's not going to be a thing for us today. Okay. All right, so not pointing at anything. Because imports were already counted in consumption, already counted in investment, because they bought some of that stuff was produced in foreign lands. So we subtract them off. So we're just counting stuff that was bought, that was produced in Ireland. Right. Okay. So here it is. Wish we had, Pointy came back. Oh, how nice. It comes and goes. Anyway, it's going to be fun. Yeah, I don't even have a pointy stick, I don't think. What you going to do? Oh, we don't have that today. All right. So GDP is Y. It's always going to be Y. And we can think of this always in three ways. It can be expenditure, it can be income, it can be stuff produced. And we will go back and forth between thinking of it as expenditure, income, and stuff produced, even in the same sentence. We'll use it in two or three different ways. So it's always the same thing, but it's just, the three aspects of the same thing. And that's going to equal all the stuff that we buy. So consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And sadly, I can do this without even looking at the board. Consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, right? Because I've memorized it over 20 years. Don't memorize it. You're going to see it so many times, you will know it. This is going to come up over and over and over and over again. This is the expenditure way of calculating GDP. Okay. To test yourself, do you understand what's going on? One thing to ask is, why do we subtract off imports? If you don't know that, not like now, I just told you, but when you come back and you're looking at your notes, check. Do you still understand it? If not, that's a good time to correct that, right? Okay. So here's UK GDP by expenditure. This is roughly what it looks like for all developed economies. It's roughly It's not quite what it looks like for Ireland, because Ireland is a bit weird because we have all of these giant multinationals that are producing stuff here and taking the profits elsewhere. That's why I put up UK, because UK really gives you a better feeling for how big things are. Net exports can vary. Our net exports are quite large because we're doing all this international foreign direct investment. But consumption is the lion's share, followed by investment, followed by government spending, and that's more or less true for all the developed countries, right? Net exports can be bigger or smaller. Notice it's negative right there because for the UK, at this particular date, I can't remember what date it was, imports were higher than exports, right? So it becomes out negative, which is a weird thing to put in a pie with a little, there you go, there you go. Pie chart's really not designed for negative things, are they? Anyway, there we go. The important thing here to notice is that consumption is really, really big, and investment is the next biggest, maybe about the same size as government, depending on the country, varies. But consumption is almost always really, really large, which is not surprising in the sense that, like, why do we want an economy at all? Like, what's the point? Well, it's maybe to get us some stuff, some goods and services, right? Maybe it's nice if someone produces food for us so we don't starve. It's kind of nice when they build a house for us so we don't freeze and get wet, right? So all of these things are good, and that's kind of why we want an economy. And so the fact that consumption is large is kind of indicative of it's kind of delivering goods and services to people rather than solely to firms, okay? Now, consumption is large. Government spending, we're not going to have a lot really useful to say about government spending, but it's going to be important for us because it's going to be a policy tool. And investment is not nearly as big as consumption, but we are going to give it more than its share of attention because it is one of the things that changes a lot across the business cycle. You know, some years are really good and some years are really bad. You know, in 2007, the whole economy of the world pretty much tanked. And investment is one of the things that changes much more than consumption does. Okay? Consumption changes a little, but investment changes a lot. So in terms of explaining business cycles, why some years are good and some years are bad, investment's going to be really important for us for understanding where that comes from. And of course, that has knock-on effects on everybody, just because, you know. So we're gonna spend some time on investment. And we'll spend some time on consumption as well. Our first story will be a consumption story. Our second story will be an investment story. Again, we've broken them into these categories because we're thinking they're coming from different places. So we have two separate stories because they're two separate thought processes that go into these things. Okay. I will point out at this stage that GDP, gross domestic product, is going to be our main thing that we're interested in. That's going to be our why. We give it a letter. But there's another thing that you'll often see, which is gross national product. Gross domestic product is everything that's produced here. It doesn't matter who owns the factory. If it's produced here, it's going to count. And that's of interest to us because that's kind of capturing, are there jobs? Like, is there anything for people to do? Are people working this year? Are they not working this year? That kind of thing, right? Is our stuff, if nothing's being produced here, then all our people are just sitting around, right? Gross national product is about who owns the production. So if an Irish guy goes off to New York City and starts a pub or a software house or whatever, that's going to count as Irish gross national product because he's an Irish guy making the stuff. The fact that it's in New York City, selling entirely to Americans, nothing to do with anything, gross national product, it will be counted as ours, but gross domestic product will be counted as the US's, right? This is important for Ireland because in Ireland we have a whole lot of foreign direct investment. So there's a lot of stuff that counts as our gross domestic product because it's made here. Everything at Hewlett-Packard made here, but it's made officially by American company, right? All sorts of folks work there, but it's made by an American company, so it counts as American gross national product. So for most countries, gross domestic product, gross national product are kind of about the same. For Ireland, gross national product is way lower than gross domestic product because a lot of stuff that's being made here, domestic product, is actually being owned by the Americans. And this is important when you start thinking about, well, who gets the benefit of all this work? Right? Gross domestic product saying there's a lot of work here, but gross national product telling you something about who's capturing the benefit of all that work. Right? And for Ireland, it's quite a bit different. There's quite a bit of difference between the two, which is not typical of most countries. It shows up in some places like that have, that are basically export-import related countries, but usually very small. You think Singapore and these kind of places. For most countries, they're almost exactly the same. Ireland is special in this way. And we won't go into it, but just so you have an idea that there's two separate measures, and for Ireland, it's important. Okay, so that's how we measure GDP. Of course, I've ignored the income approach. The income approach is a bit tricky because we have to be very careful of what we mean by income. For that, we have to define income to be money that you make because you produce something, right? If someone gives you money, in normal English, that's income, but in macroeconomics, that's not. That's just a transfer. Right? Income is something that you earned. Gifts don't count, okay? Just definitionally. And then if we add up everybody's income, the money they made by making sandwiches, that's going to be equal to the money spent on sandwiches, which is going to be equal to the value of all the sandwiches, right? And we also have the production approach, which looks at the value added in all the chains of production. Okay? But we're going to focus on the expenditure approach because that's going to lead us into the theory. All right. So that's what GDP is. And that's going to be our main measure of economic activity in a country. And it's going to be sort of what we're thinking about when we talk about the economy. Now we're going to think more than that, but that's a large chunk of what we're thinking about and what we're going to spend the time on in this course. Okay, so before we move on and start using it for stuff, we should talk about whether it's any good. Right? We did this thing. It wasn't what we wanted. Right? We wanted to say, how nice is it to live here? Well, we couldn't do that because we couldn't even define the word nice. And then we had all this stuff, but we had to use prices to say how important each thing was. So this measure doesn't reflect any of our values about anything, what's important, what's unimportant, what is actually harmful, but still purchased in the economy, still produced. Right? It doesn't reflect any of that. We got this measure. It measures something. It doesn't measure anything that any particular person particularly wants to measure. It's adjacent to the kind of things you might want to measure. Okay? So just to sort of understand it, let's talk about something that GDP does not include, and in fact shouldn't. So GDP is actually doing the right thing here. So if I go out and I buy a house, so I buy an apartment in downtown Dublin. The apartment was made in 1864. Does that count as GDP or not? Well, what we want to do is we want to count up the goods and services produced this year. So this thing produced over 100 years ago doesn't count because it wasn't produced this year. Right? It's nice for me to get this thing. That's lovely. But it's produced ages ago. So we're trying to count up the production this year. It shouldn't count. Right? But as I purchase this thing, I've got to hire a solicitor to review the documents. I've got to pay the bank. I've got to, pay an inspector to look over the thing. And all of this is services that are being provided this year. So all those fees attached with it, all the work that I need to get done in order to buy this thing, that would count. But the house itself wouldn't. Whereas if I go off and buy a brand new house, that house would count because it was produced this year. Right? That's the basic idea. Okay? This sort of catches people out, but in fact, it's if you keep in mind what we're trying to measure, how much got produced this year, how much effort went into, how much value was created this year, then old stuff clearly wasn't made this year, so it shouldn't count. Okay. On the other hand, there's some things that should count, but don't. So if we're trying to count up all the value of the stuff produced this year, like one thing that happens is like farmers go out and they milk the cow, they sell some of the milk, they drink the rest, right? We were hippie farmers when I was a kid, and we drank all that potsy goat milk. And we were drinking, right? And so all of that goat milk was work, and it was all done, and we drank it. And that should have counted in GDP. Like it was work and effort and good things that were produced that year, but it doesn't count because it's not produced on the market. It's not sold, and therefore there's no way for us to count it. There's no real way for us to value it. Right? And some of the things that are produced, you do the farming thing, and most of you, I know, aren't farmers, but some of you are. But other things that happen, right? Sometimes, and this is shocking to me, but sometimes people cook food at home. They don't go to a restaurant. It's weird. They go and they get the ingredients and they cook it at home. Well, that's effort that goes into producing something nice. And if we're counting up all the things that got produced in this economy this year, that stuff that's produced at home should count. For example, you could, like back in the day in Ireland, in say in the 1980s, women were basically not allowed to work, with very few exceptions. Certainly if you got married, you weren't allowed to work at UCD. And so they were mostly taking care of the kids. Now, I've taken care of some kids. It is not easy. It is definitely work. It is hard. It is, but it wasn't counted because it wasn't traded on the market. Nowadays, women have gone back to work, and a lot of the kids are going into creches, and those creches are paid for. So back in the day, the child care wasn't counted, but nowadays the child care is counted. Just because the stuff that you do for yourself doesn't get counted, the stuff that someone does for you for payment does get counted. And this is just a goofy feature of the way we calculate the thing. Okay? Another thing that doesn't get counted, which isn't such a big deal here, used to be, but not so much nowadays, is barter. If you swap with somebody, right? I'll cut your wood if you'll, fix my roof. Those are values that are being created, but they're not being captured in the statistic. Undocumented work, clearly, anything that you're doing that's illegal, like undocumented work or drugs, etc. We would like to calculate these. We would like all the heroin sales to be in GDP. Because again, we're not making any value judgments here, right? We'd like to, but we can't. What we want to do is see how much stuff got produced, stuff that people are willing to pay for. People are willing to pay for the heroin, therefore the heroin should be counted. Okay. So we would like this to be counted. And you say, well, that's ridiculous. Like heroin, it's not a good thing. It's bad that it's produced. Yeah, lots of things are bad that are produced. Yachts for the mega rich, they're produced. They get sold on the market. We count them. Why not the heroin for the poor? It should balance out. Everyone's got their guilty vices, and we should count it. There's no reason for us to not count it because, again, we left our values at the door. Right? When we started using prices, we were saying explicitly, we want a value-neutral measure. And the fact that you and I think that drugs may be bad, I don't know about you, I do. Despite all my jokes, I think they're probably bad for society. Nevertheless, lots of things that are bad society are in the measure. Everything should be in the measure. If people put in work to produce the heroin, to distribute the heroin, to ship the heroin, we should include it in GDP. But of course we don't because we can't measure it because it's illegal, so everyone's hiding their activity. Right? So all these things should be included, but in fact are not. So when you think about this, it's going to be kind of problematic to use GDP for the kind of things that we naturally always actually do use it for. So one wants to say, look, our GDP is 20,000 per person, and Bangladesh's GDP is 3,000 per person. Therefore, we are 6 times as rich as Bangladesh. You want to say that, but it's complete and utter rubbish. And the numbers, you can take them out to 6 decimal places, and it looks good, it looks nice, but it's rubbish because life here is very different from life in Bangladesh. We're sending our kids to creche, they're taking care of their own kids. Kids still being taken care of, but ours is counted towards GDP, theirs is not. A lot of stuff in a farming community takes place via barter, takes place via self-sufficiency. That doesn't here. Right? We go to a lot more restaurants than they do, which means all of the cooking and the cleaning is being done by professionals who get counted in GDP instead of by people at home where it doesn't get counted in GDP. And yet all that work is still happening there. Right? So these kind of comparisons are very, very difficult because different sets of things get measured in different societies. And you think even like how far have we come? In 1980, GDP in Ireland was whatever, and now it's so much higher, we're so much richer. Yeah, maybe. I think so. I think we're richer. But GDP isn't the way to find that out. It looks like it is. Again, you can take it out to 6 decimal places. But it's not, because society now is very different from society back then. Right? Back then, women weren't working in the market. They were working, but they weren't working in the market. So they were doing all of the self-sufficiency. They were doing all the barter. And that stuff isn't being done privately anymore. A lot of that stuff is being done in the market. So it will look like GDP is higher just because society has changed. Because a lot more things are happening in the market now than used to back in the day. Okay. Now that does not, of course, stop us, because once you have numbers, it's very hard not to use them. Right? It's very hard not to do these comparisons. But in fact, all of these kind of comparisons are very, very suspicious. Between societies that are quite different from each other, it's very suspicious. Between societies over time, because things have changed, particularly in Ireland, things have changed a lot in the last 30, 40 years. Right? And so the kind of things that get counted now are very different from the kind of things that got counted before. So while you technically can do the comparisons, and people do, it's all kind of rubbish, because we can't compare those things really. Not with these numbers, right? You'd have to, I mean, you're much better off with stories, like how did you live back in the day, Grandpa? And then compare it to now, and that'll tell you a lot more than looking at these numbers. Right? But of course, that's hard, and it's so easy to take two numbers and say, well, this one is 2.3 times more than that one. But rubbish. Right? Okay. And the other issue we've got is that once you've got numbers, it's very natural to want to target numbers. Right? Once you have all these numbers, it's saying, well, okay, our problem back in the day, like way back in the day, before these sort of numbers were invented, that is, before World War II, for instance. They didn't have any measurements of the economy as a whole. And so the only way that those in power could know what was going on was to sort of get out there amongst the people. And of course, that's really hard for someone in power to actually do in any kind of useful way. And so they were genuinely ignorant about what life was like for their minions, right? Even the good ones that wanted to do well had a very hard time knowing what was going on, right? And so one of the great things about all this measurement that we have nowadays, and GDP is just the tip of the iceberg, is that it's possible for those in high places to get an idea about what's going on. And so in that sense, GDP is nice, because you can say, for example, last year GDP was 20,000. This year GDP is 18,000 per person. And then you can say, well, what the hell happened? Why did it fall by 10%? What's up with that? We're clearly making less stuff now than we were a year ago. What's with that? Okay. And that's very useful. The tempting thing, though, is to say what we want is that this is bad news, that going from 20,000 per person to 18,000 per person is bad. Right? It's very natural. Higher number is clearly good. The more you produce, the more stuff you got. It's all nice. But it's not that way, right? It's not actually true that we necessarily want more. So let's consider two economies. We got Ireland way back in the day, 1840. Occasionally it puts its little red thing there. I don't know what's up. 1840. So here we're in the potato famine days. So we have huge exports and we have very small imports. Our GDP, reasonably high. We're producing a lot of potatoes, but it's all going to the poxy British, and they're eating our potatoes. And it's very sad. Everyone's starving here. Bad news, right? This is a bad place to live. You know, the music's still good, but I'm saying, like, it's nice to eat. Right. Whereas you can contrast that with Ivanland, which in Ivanland, what we got is we got a beach. And we sit on the beach and we say, pina colada. And a foreigner brings us a pina colada and puts it in our hands. And we say, Netflix. And the foreigners produce a lot of movies and TV shows, and they set up a foreign TV in front of us, and we watch the Netflix, and we drink our pina coladas. And that's what happens in Ivanland. That's the whole economy. We produce nothing. We just have foreigners cater to our every whim. Okay? So this is a country that has actually no GDP, right? We produce nothing. We produce nothing whatsoever. Okay? If you wanted to add this up, by the way, in the expenditure method, we would say, well, we bought all this stuff. We bought a pina colada, but that was imported. So we add in 5 euros for the pina colada, getting a very cheap pina colada, by the way. 5 euros for the pina colada, and then we subtract 5 euros off from imports, and it comes to 0 GDP, which makes sense because GDP is a measure of how much we produced, and we produce nothing because we're just lying on the beach there. Okay. So this is Ivanland. It depends on your taste, but clearly, I think, Ivanland is a better place to live than old days Ireland, right? Well, at least fly with me with this, right? Starving bad, free pina coladas and Netflix good, right? This is the okay. So clearly high GDP can't be the goal, right? Because Ivanland has 0 GDP. Ireland, back in the day, has quite large GDP. They produced a lot of stuff, but they don't get the benefit of the stuff. The stuff is going to foreigners, right? So people are working really hard back in the day, but they're getting no benefit. In my little fictional world, we're not working at all, but we're getting huge benefits. Right? So high GDP cannot be the goal. Right. What do we have on that? Okay. Okay. So what are we missing out on here? Well, clearly we can't live in Ivanland because, first of all, you guys don't have visas, and I'm the guy with the visa authority, and I'm not giving you any visas. But more to the point, it's the stupid foreigners. They just won't give us this stuff for free. Right? We go and we say, hey, you foreign weirdos, could you send us some free stuff? And they look at us like we're nuts, and they don't send us anything. They give us some insults back, I fart in your general direction, that whole thing. And we don't get any stuff. So we can't live in Ivanland because foreigners won't cooperate. In order to get them to do all this nice stuff for us, we have to do some nice stuff for them as well, which means we have to put in some work, right? So it's clearly a fictional sort of place, but if it could happen, it would be better, right? So what's the trouble here? Well, let's see. So what are the problems with GDP? What is it not capturing that it should capture? Well, first of all, it's only measuring the goods that are transacted in the market, which works reasonably well if the market contains most of the goods that are produced. Right? In countries and societies where the market doesn't contain most of the goods that are produced, it's kind of more useless. Right? It does not include externalities. That is, when I drive my car, I make the streets more dangerous and louder and more smoggy for you. So I get the full value of driving the car, but we don't include the fact that I'm making your life miserable. Right? And there's good externalities as well. Right? If I go out and buy a lawnmower and mow my lawn, then you have the nice grass smell and you see a pretty thing when you look out your window, and that's good for you. But again, we're not including that goodness to you. So it's not really capturing the goodness or the badness of anything. It's just the cost of it transacted in the market. And therefore, it doesn't reflect most people's values, and I think more fairly, it doesn't reflect anybody's values because people are more than just, they care more about they care about more things than just what's transacted in the market and the price for it. And most importantly, it doesn't in any way balance the value of the thing created with the benefit with the cost of doing that, right? To produce stuff takes effort. That's unfortunate, right? That's a downer in life, the fact that we have to go to work. You're all very nice and all, but I'm just saying, going to work is a downer. And it's not balanced in there anywhere. Just saying if you work more, we're going to have higher GDP. Right? Not saying anything about if you work more, you're going to have a shittier life. And we got to balance these two things against each other. It's not in there anywhere. Right? So if we wanted to get GDP, and this is just a sort of very, very stark just to show you what's going on. If we wanted GDP in Ireland to go up, what we could do is we could just enslave everyone, have some guys with whips, and make us all work 23 hours a day. And that would get GDP to go up. Okay? That's clearly a bad thing, right? But it would, in fact, get GDP to go up. Another thing we could do is we could get a bunch of bulldozers and just bulldoze Dublin, just knock the whole place down. January 1st, we knock the whole place down, everyone's out in the rain, and that would get GDP to go up. Why? Because all our houses are gone and now we're cold and wet, and so we're going to work really, really, really hard to build new houses, right? So that we're not cold and wet. And so both of these things are bad, right? Knocking everything down in Dublin is a bad thing, and yet it gets GDP to go up. Having everyone enslaved is a bad thing, but it gets GDP to go up. GDP cannot be the goal. Okay? We're going to talk a lot like it is, but remember there's always a balance. Clearly we want more than zero because, again, the foreigners won't give us stuff for free. So we want to put in some effort so that stuff comes to us. Food, housing, Netflix, all that good stuff, we want it to come to us. But we need to balance that against the effort that it takes to create that stuff, the externalities that we might be placing on other people when we produce and use that stuff. And we need to balance those two out. The number does not do that for us. The number just says, how much stuff did you produce, or the value of the stuff that's produced in the market this year. It doesn't balance that against the cost of producing it in any way. So high GDP, not the goal. Okay. And like we were saying, it's very difficult to compare GDP across countries because society is very different. Different things happen in the market in different countries. Exchange rates become a major issue. Like if I'm comparing our GDP with American GDP or UK GDP, which we love to compare it against UK GDP because for a little while we were higher than them, and I was so happy. We love to do that, but there's an exchange rate involved, and the exchange rates can be a bit goofy. And so a lot of what we're picking up on those comparisons are what happened to the exchange rates. I mean, if you take a class in exchange rates or international finance in economics, you'll find out that like exchange rates go all over the place. They can be really, really strange for 5, 6, 7, 8 years before they come back down to a reasonable level. So it's very hard to make those comparisons in a reasonable way. And across time, right, society is changing, hopefully for the better, in lots of ways for the better, and certainly dramatically in Ireland. Right? And so our society today is very different from the society back in the day, and therefore the comparisons are going to be very problematic because different things happen on the market now than happened on the market before. Okay. And yet, for all that, for all my ragging on GDP, and all of that is absolutely and totally fair, and there's way too much emphasis on these numbers in general. On the other hand, it does seem to capture something. Okay? So here we've organized countries by sort of how rich they are. It's all developing countries, the very least developed countries, I think the lowest 10%, and then the high income OECD countries. And we have GDP per person. We've organized them by GDP, so it's not a shock that the countries that have high GDP have high GDP. And the countries that have middle GDP have middle GDP, and the countries that have low GDP have low GDP. That's by construction. Doesn't mean much in and of itself because, again, there's this balancing act. There's this fact that we have home production and market production. And yet, and we can't measure lots of things about life, right? Life is not measurable. Happiness is not measurable. Friendship is not measurable. But some things are measurable. And so for everything that we really can measure, that we think, yeah, this is actually important to life, it seems very much correlated with GDP. So for example, life expectancy at birth. How many years do you get to live to get your happiness? Well, in the high income countries, you get almost 80 years. In the lowest income countries, you get 54 years. Right? There's an extra, 25 years almost, 24 years. That's nice, right? It's nice to have an extra 24 years. That's got to be, generally speaking, good, assuming people, enjoy their life. Infant mortality, right? We weren't measuring infant mortality. We're just doing GDP. And yet, in the high-income countries, it's about 5 per 1,000, whereas almost 10% are dying in the least developed countries. And you can, think of the sadness of the baby who died. Clearly very sad. You can think of the sadness of the mother, of the father, of the brother. There's a lot of sadness put into that. And it's nicer if the babies don't die than if the babies do die. Now, there are exceptions, right? There's countries that have high GDP where a fair number of babies die. And there's countries that have low GDP where not so many die. And yet, overall, it seems like higher GDP is definitely associated with lower infant mortality, and that's got to be good, right? I don't know your personal values. I think that's good. Going out on a limb here, really taking the controversial position. Live babies better than dead babies. Yeah, I'm standing by that. And you can see the others. Some of them Infant mortality, child mortality, that's very sad. Literacy rates may be good, maybe bad. Maybe it's better if we don't read. I don't know. But we tend to think that knowledge is good. Like maybe it's our bias, but clearly, like anything that we can really come to measure, it looks like, by and large, it's much better in the high-income countries, meaning high GDP countries, than in the low GDP countries. Okay. So it doesn't, it can't be the goal to get GDP higher. Like maybe it would be better to have the goal be let's lower infant mortality, like more direct, getting at the things we actually care about. But it seems like it's easier to lower infant mortality if you're rich than if you're poor, which I think that is a terrible shock to anyone, right? So it's not what we want to measure. It's not all that good of a measure, but it is something that does seem to be important, or at least correlated with the things that are important. So all else equal, if you knew nothing else about a country and you were deciding where to be born, high-income country better than low-income country in lots of ways, every way that we can measure. Who knows about, do people get along and are they nice to each other and this kind of thing, which is clearly important as well. Okay. So that's GDP. We're going to use that as sort of our baseline for how much economic activity there is in a country, and we're going to be looking at what can we do to keep there from being like really booms and crashes in GDP, this kind of thing. Okay, going forward. So GDP is something that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that C plus I equals G plus Z exports. Oh, until you're so bored of that. So we're coming back to that. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about prices. And so prices and inflation, basically the same thing, in a way that you'll see in a minute. And this is because our GDP measure, as it is kind of useless, because we said, I want to measure how much stuff got produced. Okay? And then we said, well, we don't know which things are important. Let's multiply it by the prices. And so now we have our GDP is just price times quantity. The quantity is the thing that we want to measure. The price is how important these things are. But now if GDP is higher next year, we don't know why that is. We don't know whether GDP is higher because we're producing more stuff, or if GDP is higher because prices went up. There's no way to tell. It's just a number, and that number is price times quantity for all the stuff that's produced in the economy. So we need some way to get rid of those prices. It's called deflating the quantity, deflating the measure, so that it's, instead of being measured in euros, which GDP is, the number of euros value of stuff produced this year, we want it measured in sort of some measure of stuff, something that we can compare it year on year, so we can say, are we producing more stuff? Are we producing less stuff? Because at the moment we can't. All we know is that price times quantity went up, but we don't know whether that's price or that's quantity. Okay? And this is important for lots and lots of things. Like, if you're getting paid, hopefully you're getting paid. As you're working, hopefully you're getting paid. Unpaid internships, bad. As you're doing this, and your wage goes up, you're actually wondering, okay, my wage went up by 50 cents an hour, great, but is that as fast as prices were going up? So am I able to buy more or less than I was last year? My wage went up, but also prices went up. So can I buy more or less, right? Am I getting a raise, or am I actually getting what's that inverse of a raise, the opposite of a raise? Pay cut, that's two words. Getting a pay cut in real terms, in terms of stuff that I can actually buy. So for this, we need to talk about the price level. So that's our next quick section. Hopefully we can finish this today and be done with measurement altogether. So for this, we need a price index. And the basic idea of a price index is we just want to say, did prices go up or did prices go down? But it is never that simple, because every year some prices went up and some prices went down. And some prices went up a lot and some prices just went up a little. They never all go up exactly the same amount. If they all went up the same amount, they all went up by 10%, we're golden, prices went up by 10%. But it's not that way. Some prices went up by 30%, other prices went down by 5%. And so we have to say which prices are more important and which prices are less important. Okay? It's the same problem we had before. Before we said we have all this stuff, we need to compare the stuff, we need to say which things are important and which things are unimportant. Now we have all the prices, and we need to say which prices are important and which prices are less important. Same problem. Okay? We solved it before by saying, okay, we wonder what's happening to this stuff. We need to say which ones are important. Let's use prices to decide which one is important. Okay? Imperfect, but it's what we did. Okay? We're going to do the same thing in reverse now. We're going to say, we have all these prices doing all kinds of things. Let's use the amount that we buy to say which ones are important. So we're concerned about prices, and we're going to use quantities to determine which one's important and which one's unimportant. And to sort of illustrate that, suppose that I told you that rent in Dublin is going up by 50% next year. Okay, that's probably true. But suppose I told you rent in Dublin's going up by 50%. You'd be bummed out about that, right? This is not good news. What if I told you that Ferraris are going up in price next year by 50%? Now, well, one of them is like a really bad news, and the Ferrari one, for most of you, maybe it's interesting, I don't know, but it's not important to you, right? Because you don't buy any Ferraris. So if the price of Ferrari goes up through the roof, it doesn't really matter. But you do have to live in Dublin, and so when the price of houses goes up in Dublin, that actually affects you, right? The fact that you're buying apartments or renting apartments in Dublin means that you care about that price a lot more than you care about the price of Ferraris, which you're not buying anyway, right? You might even be happy. Yeah, stick it to those rich bastards. Whatever. I don't know your political leanings, but you could. Like, that would be reasonable. I don't think any of you would be thrilled about the price of rent going up in Dublin. Maybe a couple of you like own apartments and you're renting them out to people. You'd be, oh man, it'd be a different attitude. But clearly, if you're buying the thing, it affects you more than if you're not buying the thing. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to see what people buy, and we're going to use that as the importance of that price to them. Okay. Okay. Okay, that's just what I said. So our main price index is going to be the Consumer Price Index. Now there's loads of price index. There's the Producer Price Index, there's the Wholesale Price Index, there's the Dublin Consumer Price Index, there's the Galway Consumer Price Index, there's the Cork Consumer Price Index. There's loads of these things. Once you know how to do one, you know how to do all of them. So we're going to do the Consumer Price Index because that's the one we normally care about. If we say prices, that's what we're normally talking about. Okay? So what we need to do is we need to say, well, we're concerned about how these price changes affect a typical consumer. Why a typical consumer? Because we're doing the Consumer Price Index. So that's who we care about, the typical consumer. We pick that as the person we care about, and we're going to say, how do these price changes affect that person? Okay. So what we do is we pick a base year. Let's pick 2010 as our base year. Pick 2010 as our base year. We go around and we find out, what did a typical Irish consumer buy in 2010? And we put that in our trolley, or technically our basket. The jargon is basket because Americans shop in shopping baskets, whereas the rest of us shop in shopping trolleys, right? So for us it's a trolley, for them it's a basket. The jargon is basket because Americans get to decide the jargon. That's just the law. I'm sorry, we just have to live with that. Okay. So we put it in our shopping basket. We take a trolley, we're going down, and we say, what does a typical Irish consumer buy? We put in the pasta, we put in the potatoes, we put in the housing, we put in the gasoline, we put in everything that a typical consumer buys into our shopping trolley, and we say, that is our consumer basket. Everything a typical consumer bought in the base year, in 2010, goes into that trolley. And then we just go around every year and we see how much it costs to buy that trolley of goods each and every year. Right, so the first year, it costs, $10,000 to buy. The second year, it costs $12,000 to buy, which means that same basket costs more in the second year than in the first year. So we say on average, the cost of that consumer price index, the cost of that basket of goods went up by 20%, from $10,000 to $12,000. Right? And that's our consumer price index. We pick our trolley of goods and we shop it around each and every year. Okay? Importantly, here the trolley of goods is staying the same. So every year we're taking the same trolley around to see how much it costs. And you can see, like, sometimes the supermarkets do this, right? They say, we got this basket of goods and we bought, we saw how much it cost in Dunn's and we saw how much it costs in Lidl, and look, Lidl's so much cheaper, right? Now maybe they're manipulating the basket to get the things that are particularly cheap in their place. But here we're just trying to find out what a typical consumer bought in 2010, find out how much it costs every year. And so because we're keeping the basket the same, any change has to be a change in the prices. Okay. And then we convert it into an index. So we just divide it through by the base year price. So on 2010, we go around and found out that it's 10,000 euros. The next year, so we call that 100. We divide it by itself, multiply by 100. And so 10,000 divided by 10,000 times 100, the base year cost of the basket of goods is 100. The next year, it costs 12,000 to buy that same basket of goods. So we divide it by 10,000, the base year price, that's 1.2, multiply it by 100, the consumer price index is 120. So it's really just measuring the cost of buying this basket, but we put it on a scale that starts at 100, just so that the numbers are nice and neat and clean. Okay. So if you look at the consumer price index, it'll look like, so in our particular case, for 2008, it would probably be 8,500, so 85, right? And then in 2009, it'll be 92, going up. In 10,000, our base year, it'll be 100. The next year it's 120, 127, whatever. And it tends to keep going up. Doesn't have to, but tends to keep going up. But it's all centered around 100, where 100 is the cost of that basket in the base year. There's a couple of things I should mention about this that make it a little bit not quite this, but this is exactly the idea. We take our consumer price, our basket of goods that a typical consumer buys, and we shop it around each and every year to see how much it costs. That simple. A couple of wrinkles are that we can't keep doing this forever. Like if way back in the day we picked our typical consumer basket in our base year of 1892, and we said, okay, how many horses does a person buy, and how many whips does a person buy, and all the stuff that you bought in 1892, right? Is going to be very different from the kind of stuff we buy now. And so that basket of goods is going to be kind of useless for us now. The fact that they spent a lot and the price of horses have gone way up through the roof is kind of irrelevant to you guys, right? Much more interested in the price of cars and the price of gasoline and the price of, or they weren't even putting the gasoline in there in 1892. So we have to update this basket every once in a while, right? So every 10 years or so, they update the basket because society is changing and the stuff that a typical consumer buys has changed over that amount of time. So they have to update this basket. But the principle is we keep the basket the same forever. It's just the fact that society is changing that means we have to update it occasionally. Hi. So criticisms of this. This is my friend Sidney Afriat, who is actually fairly famous. Price indexes are answers without questions. He is like one of the big gurus of price indexes. Like he wrote the book, like seriously, but no. So he knows a lot about price indexes. There's no natural question that price index is an answer to. Right? So you might say, like what people want to say about price indexes is the cost of living has gone up by 20% because last year the price index was 100 and this year it's 120. So a basket of goods that same basket of goods costs 20% more this year than it does last year. And so the cost of living went up by 20%. Now, even though living is more expensive, it's still popular, so people continue to live. So but that's not true, right? Because if, like, for example, suppose we have taxis in that bundle of goods, and the real cost of, like most of the price changes just in our pretend little world, are because taxi prices went way up. So the cost of taking a taxi doubled over that year. There's a legislation, now it's twice as much. So that's clearly bringing up the price of goods, right? Because in 2010, people took a certain number of taxi trips, and now those taxi trips are more costly. So the price, the value, the cost of doing that same thing is higher. But of course, so that would mean that if you had 20% more money, you could buy the same stuff that you did before. But suppose you did have 20% more money, right? And so now you could afford the same lifestyle you did before. You still wouldn't, right? You'd say, oh, my God, it's expensive to take a taxi. Let me take a bus a little bit, save that money, and buy something else. Because you have 20% more money, you could do exactly the same thing, but in fact, you would not choose to. You would choose to do something else, right? Because that's ridiculous. Who's going to pay that stupid price, right? If I'm addicted to coffee, but if the price of coffee goes way up, I will tend to buy more tea, right? Because caffeine fix either way. It's not as good, but what can you do, right? And therefore, I could save money to do other things. And so there's no natural question that the price index is an answer to. It just gives us an idea how the prices are changing. Okay, let me leave it there. I need to let you go, and I will see you next time.